my name is Layla, for those of you who don't know me, and I am excited to be teaching this morning. I thought I'd start with just sharing a little bit about who I am. My husband, Daniel, and we've really enjoyed being a part of Midtown this year, and we together have two sons, Grant and Everett. And I work for a collegiate ministry called InterVarsity. And another thing you might not know, I'm the daughter of immigrants. My dad is from Lebanon, my mom is from Japan, and that's partly why my name is spelled Layla, but pronounced Lila. Both my parents pronounce it differently. And that's part of what makes me me. So I'm looking forward to unpacking this theme of sharing your life with others today. Over the last month, we've been in this Reoriented series where each week we've been exploring spiritual practices to help us live lives of worship in practical and meaningful ways as a community. And last week, Andrew led us into what it looks like to relinquish the false self, or to let go of the masks that we wear and just bring our whole selves, our brokenness and everything, to God and to others. And one area that God has been working in me through this series is just really unpacking this drive that I have to be perceived as capable and to be capable, but also to be perceived as capable. I think the quarantine and working from home with little children, 3 and 1, just has really brought that to the surface. There's nothing like leading a Zoom training and feeling really professional while your toddler is like trying to sit on your neck. And I think that's just really kind of unpacked that for me. And it's just been really great to process that here as a community. So this week, we will continue this series of sharing my life with others, sharing our lives with others. And it's a really interesting topic to explore while we're in the middle of a global pandemic. What does it look like to share our lives with others, especially during a time we've been asked to distance ourselves from others? I think that we have a lot that we can learn from this passage that we'll explore today. We're going to look at an encounter that Jesus has with a woman at a well who, for very different reasons, has been experiencing social distancing. And I think she can teach us what it takes to share our lives with others, even in the midst of this quarantine that we're all experiencing. So this passage that we're going to be looking at, this encounter is recorded in the Gospel of John, and it's one of the biographies of Jesus. And it's pretty long. So it's chapter 4, verse 1 through 42. And I wish we had the time to unpack every detail of this passage because it is rich with meaning. But due to time, I'm really going to just overview and examine this passage through the relational lens. But there is so much here that Jesus does in this one encounter. Jesus cuts through race, religion, gender, power, dynamics in this one encounter. And I think it's definitely worth exploring in detail. In fact, if you leave here with like a thirst to do that, I really recommend a book by Brenda Salter McNeil called A Credible Witness. She does a brilliant job unpacking the layers in this passage, this one passage. So John chapter 4, 1 through 42. So we begin with Jesus. Jesus is traveling from Judea to Galilee. And in verse 4, it says, Jesus had to go through Samaria. But technically, he didn't have to go through Samaria. The main road that would have gotten him from Galilee to Judea actually bypassed Samaria. And in verse 9, we see a little bit of a reason why. Verse 9 says, for Jews do not associate with Samaritans. And this was to say the least. Samaritans were despised by the Jews, and the cultural and religious animosity between them was very thick. But Jesus had to go through there. And here he is now. He's in a town in Samaria in the heat of the day, at a well, hot and thirsty, and waiting. And when the Samaritan woman arrives to draw water, he asks her for a drink. And she's totally taken aback by what happens. And she tells him as much. She says, "How can you ask me for a drink?" Not only is she not expecting to see anybody at the well at this time of day, but the last person she expects to see, let alone talk to her, is a Jewish man. And yet Jesus does. And the next few verses capture their conversation. And what begins with Jesus asking for her for a drink became him offering her living water, a living water, a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And she's curious and she's interested. I mean, anything to keep her from coming back to that well. And as if Jesus could pinpoint the unquenched thirst in her life, Jesus asked the woman to go get her husband. And she's honest. I have no husband. And Jesus affirms her honesty. He tells her what he knows, that she's had 5 husbands and is now with a man who's not her husband. And in a culture where women have no power to divorce, this communicates as much about how she's been treated, how she's been valued, as the choices that she's made in her life. Jesus draws out who she is, but not in a condemning way. And you can see this by how she responds. She recognizes that Jesus is different. He knows things about her, a prophet maybe. And she asks him a burning question, an honest question. What is the right way to worship? And what happens next is really amazing, because it's here in Samaria with this woman that Jesus reveals that he's the Messiah, the one that her people have been waiting for. And it's the first time we see Jesus do this in the Gospel of John. It's as if he's saying, don't worry about the right way to worship. I want to tell you that the one to worship is right here with you. And her encounter with Jesus is so transforming. Her immediate reaction is to leave her water jar and go back to town and tell her people what she's discovered. In verse 29 to 30 and 39, she says, come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? And they came out of the town and they made their way toward Jesus. And many of the Samaritans from that town believed because of the woman's testimony. In both her encounter with Jesus and her community, this woman embodies what it looks like to work out your faith in the context of community and share your life with others. It's as if as this woman is transformed by Jesus, everything around her becomes transformed. I imagine her that morning sighing this big sigh as she picked up the heavy water jars and began to trek down towards that well at the hottest time of day, knowing full well why. And I wondered how she viewed herself, what her self-talk was, how others viewed her as they saw her walking by. And then I picture her running back to town, freed of the buckets, but totally full of conviction as she broke through the awkwardness with this huge grin of wonder on her face. Come and see. Could it be? And it's not just one way. As she took a risk to be seen, her community took a risk to listen to her, to receive her. They didn't reduce her to a single story or write her off. And together they go and they explore Jesus. And isn't that the hope of community? Isn't that what we as followers of Jesus want? To connect with each other in authentic, loving ways that lead us closer to Christ. And it's because of her willingness to do that, to share her life with others, that her whole community is transformed. In my own life, like the Samaritan woman, I have experienced things that have left me feeling distance from others. Growing up, even with friends by my side, I really struggled to feel connected and known. And that inner loneliness came to a head and just drove me to quench that thirst in unsatisfying ways, whether it was relationships or performance or just doing things I didn't want that would make me feel that connection. And sometime in my 20s, sometime in college, my very close friend started to follow Jesus. And I started to watch a peace fill her life in ways that I was really envious of. And I was curious. I started taking steps to explore Jesus and this Jesus that was transforming her life. I was really compelled, but to be honest, I had no idea what it meant to follow Jesus. And there was this really key moment, this conversation that we had where my friend just lovingly and graciously helped me understand that following Jesus wasn't just about knowing about Jesus. It wasn't just doing things that were religious, but it was about actively being in a relationship with Jesus, that I could simply talk to God. And it was like this spark that helped my faith come alive. it sparked my journey to following Jesus. And I needed those dots to kind of be connected. And I'm grateful that she was willing to kind of have that conversation with me and share her life with me. Don't underestimate the power of showing up and just sharing your life with someone. More recently, my husband and I have been navigating this new normal of working from home with two little kids. And this quarantine has left us beyond overwhelmed at times. And community has been a lifeline in this season in the form of check-in calls and texts, cookie drop-offs, appropriately distanced walks with friends, and even tear-filled venting sessions as we process all that's going on right now. And in the oddest way, this sheltering in place has actually helped us get to know our neighbors better. It's in this season I'm reminded just how meaningful and vital authentic relationships are. But what keeps us from going there? What does it take to open ourselves to others, to share our life with others? Well, taking our cue from the woman at the well, I think that we can learn that sharing your life with others takes a few things. It takes initiative, it takes vulnerability, and it takes a willingness to dialogue, to have a conversation. We see the woman take initiative both with Jesus in her curiosity of asking questions, as well as with her community by just going back to them and telling them what she's experienced. And every step that she took back towards her town, towards the very people she sought to avoid and distance herself from, is marked by vulnerability. She was willing to push through the barriers, the awkwardness, the shame, to show up, be seen, and to tell her story. And she's willing to dialogue. She was willing to have a conversation. There's an endearing honesty about her, both with Jesus and her community. She asks genuine questions. She fans her curiosities into flame. She tells her story as she's experiencing it, and she's really compelling. In fact, it's because of her that many in her town get to even experience and meet Jesus for themselves. And she didn't have to do any of it, not with Jesus, not with others, but she was willing to take the risk, to take initiative, be vulnerable, and engage in conversations that broke through the shame that would keep her from being seen. And shame is a powerful barrier. A few years ago, when my oldest was young, like 6 months old, my husband and I were doing like a front yard picnic, and we were playing with our son and just relishing in him. And I went to like pass him. I was like holding him like an airplane, and I went to pass him off to my husband. And I don't think I clearly communicated that he was taking him, because next thing I knew, he had fallen on the ground. And it wasn't too far. It was like a foot or so, to off the ground. But he started crying. The baby started crying. I started crying. I freaked out. I called our pediatrician. I was still crying. I just felt horrible. I felt like, what kind of mom lets her son fall like that? And I picked up the phone and I called one of my best friends. And I just was like, this just happened. I'm kind of shaken. And she was just so great and calming, and just had told me even stories of how when her kids had fallen. And it just made me feel like, okay, I'm not a horrible mom. This happens and it's okay. And it reminded me of the C.S. Lewis quote, "Friendship is born when one friend says to another, 'What? You too? I thought I was the only one.'" And I love that by sharing that experience with each other, it just cut through the shame that I was feeling that this could happen on my watch. Another more tender experience that we've had in the experience of community and sharing our lives with others, it happened before we had kids. It was when Daniel and I were trying to start a family, and we had just experienced our second pregnancy loss. And we had suffered silently through the first, but this was a little farther along, and this we decided that we didn't want to do that again, and we decided we'd let other people know what we were going through. And it was really hard to do. Even now, talking about it was really hard. It felt really raw to share while we were still grieving, but it was really worth it. In doing so, we experienced such a loving embrace of family and friends. As we shared our experience, our pain, our longings, our friends listened and cried with us and reached out and served us. And they just shared it in our grief. We got to tell our whole story, and any of the shame and the guilt and the fear that we carried felt lighter because we carried it with others. I had friends who shared their own, friends and family that vulnerably shared their own experiences of loss with us, even recent ones, and then we got to journey with them in that. Sharing our lives with others was one way that God actually used to heal our grief. There's a quote, and I'll put it in the chat later, but it's from the Spiritual Disciplines Handbook, where this series is kind of founded on, by Adele Calhoun. And I love what she says about this authentic, raw vulnerability when we share our lives with others. She says, sharing our lives with others is always a risk. Authenticity, interdependence, being known come at a cost. But the alternative is to live cut off from God. By appropriately opening ourselves to each other in the presence of Christ, we learn how to become safe people who bring God's welcoming embrace to others. We learn to become safe people who bring God's welcoming embrace to others. I love how the woman at the well embodied this, and how she experienced Jesus and was transformed, and then brought that to her community, and they were transformed. And I've shared some stories of how I've experienced this. And I want to invite you to consider, how might God be inviting you to live this out in this week in small, simple ways? What would it look? What are some ways that you can take a risk to share your life with others this week? So in just a few minutes, we're going to break out into smaller groups for personal conversations and processing. I shared earlier, that's been a really rich experience for me. It's hard not to meet in person as a church, but one of the blessings or positives of being a virtual church is that we do get to have these breakout conversations and practice community and sharing our lives with each other in a brief way each week. So maybe for you, if you've never really thought of taking that risk, perhaps a starting place for you today is to stick around and practice this very thing here with this community in the breakouts. So I'd like to end just with prayer. I'd like to pray that God would not only continue to shape us into a community that is transformed and agents of transformation, but that in doing so, that we would be experiencing the risk and vulnerability and willingness to dialogue the way that we see in this passage. So join me in prayer. God, I'm so grateful that that we have this encounter with this woman, God, recorded for us, that we can learn and catch this glimpse, God, of how willing you are, Lord, to just break through any barrier and cut through any of the dynamics at play that could keep us from you, Lord. And God, I pray that we would take our cue from this woman, God, that we would be people of risk, of vulnerability, of initiative, and of dialogue. God, that our openness to engage in authentic relationships would lead to not only personal transformation, but holistic community transformation. Would you start here in this place, in this community, and like ripple effects outward, God, to our neighborhoods, to our city, and to our world. And so we love you, Lord, and we trust that as we take risks to share our lives with others, that you will back us up with your spirit and do transforming things. We love you and we pray in Jesus' name.